From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
November 22nd, 1963. Everybody, you know exactly where you were and exactly what you were doing that day. It just seared into your memory. You can't get away from it, you know.
This is Arlington National Cemetery in our nation's capital. More than 400,000 souls are resting here, including the 35th President of the United States, John Kennedy. 50 years ago, he was killed by an assassin's bullet in Dallas, Texas. During the course of this broadcast, we're going to look back at the events of November 22nd, 1963 and the days that followed. And we're doing so with the man who led Kennedy's burial team, Sumter, South Carolina native Jim Felder. He wanted to join the Air Force, but was instead drafted by the Army. And as a result, he had a front row seat to history.
It started at Fort Jackson. Spent 6 months here at Fort Jackson. Basic training, AIT, leadership school. So after 6 months, one afternoon, the old sergeant major fell out the whole battalion and said, we need to send some men up to Washington, up to Arlington, up to Fort Myer, Virginia to try out for the Honor Guard. So there was a screening. 10 out of 1,000 of us made the cut, and they sent us up to DC to try out for the Honor Guard. We spent 2 weeks there, the 10 of us, and 2 of us made the cut. The other 8 were shipped off to Vietnam. That was my beginning of my military story. I was assigned to the Honor Guard unit in Washington, D.C., whose primary responsibility is to bury the dead in Arlington Cemetery and perform ceremonies around the Washington, D.C. area. My team, there were some days we would do 10 funerals the same day. How you do that? You start at 9 o'clock. The first funeral is always at 9 in the morning. You have 30 minutes to do a funeral, or the family has 30 minutes to do it. We are always at the grave site when the hearse arrives. We take the body out, the casket out, put it over the grave site. We clench the flag and we hold it taut. And then the service begins, whether it's Catholic, Greek, or whatever. 20 minutes, the priest or rabbi has to do the service. We fold the flag, pass it to the family, get on the bus, get to the next grave site for the 10 o'clock funeral. And we repeat that at 10, 10:30, 11, 11:30. Go back to the barracks, we have lunch. We start back at 1. There's a funeral at 1, 1:30, 2, 2:30. Last funeral is always at 3 o'clock in Arlington. No weekend funerals, only Monday through Fridays. It causes you to become kind of cold and callous when you do that many funerals and you watch families cry and so forth. Some guys couldn't handle it. They'd stay on the team a month or so and they said, no, I can't do this anymore. So they'd asked to be reassigned someplace else. We had rehearsed for a presidential funeral. President Hoover was ill up in New York, and they feared that he was going to pass. We had not had a state funeral or a president's funeral since President Franklin Roosevelt, which was back in 1945. So when Hoover got ill, they thought that we'd better pull the teams together and practice. Because he was president, it required a joint team. We had practiced together. We had all the steps down, all the motions, everything we needed to do. Well, President Hoover got better and went home. But this was October of '63. Not knowing that 5 weeks later, November 22nd, we would be together again for Kennedy's funeral.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade.
When the president was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, I was a short timer. I had 57 days left to do in the Army. Was on leave, waiting for my wife to get off from work. We're going to get in the Volkswagen and head home to Sumter for the Thanksgiving holidays. That was not to happen. With 57 days left in the Army, you start looking for employment. So I was out job hunting. Came out of the Department of Agriculture, and there were these ladies gathered around this taxi, crying. I went over nosy, wanted to know what was going on. The old cab driver said to me, very stoic, very cold, they shot Kennedy. I said, what do you mean? Kennedy's in Dallas today. That's where they shot him, in Dallas.
What was a wonderful welcome in downtown Dallas has become a scene of indescribable horror as hundreds of people crowd outside the back door to the emergency room here at Parkland Hospital. faces are ashen white, and people are wondering, is our president going to live?
I didn't know what to do. Jumped in my little car, turned the radio on, my Volkswagen, rode around D.C. for a while, waiting for updates, confirmation if he was dead or alive. Decided to go home, lived in Southeast Washington, walked in the door, the telephone was ringing, it was my first sergeant. He said, "Sergeant Felder, your leave has been canceled. You need to get out here to Fort Bayard, get your team of casket bearers together. You got to go to Dallas to pick up the president's body." Well, while we were trying to get ourselves assembled and dressed and getting transportation to Andrews Air Force Base to fly to Dallas, President Johnson was already on his way back to D.C. Took the oath of office on Air Force One.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
He wanted to get out of Dallas. It had been a terrible day. We waited on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base for Air Force One to come in. By then it's almost dark. And we took the body off the Air Force One. There was some trouble getting it off because his aides also wanted to help, so they really got in our way, but what can you do? You know? In all of the commotion and jostling, because we didn't have proper equipment to do it, one of the handles got broken. We finally got the casket in a gray Navy ambulance for transportation over to Bethesda Naval Hospital for autopsy and whatever else needed to be done. My crew and I were able to fly over in a helicopter, so we were there when the body arrived. The autopsy, which I witnessed, went on for 6 hours. It started like 8 in the evening and didn't finish until about 2 a.m. They were trying to find, they took hundreds of pictures, trying to find out where the slug went, because he was hit twice. 3 shots were fired. But they couldn't find the second slug, and they kept probing and cutting and probing and cutting. Finally, at 2 o'clock, they just said, well, this is it. We discovered that the casket the president came up in was not going to be useful because of that broken handle. 3 of President Kennedy's, what I call them, the Boston Mafia, Larry O'Brien, O'Donnell and Dave Powers, they went out to buy a new casket. Miss Kennedy was in the hospital all of the time, but she refused to leave the hospital, refused to change her dress. She was still in that blood-stained pink dress. So this trio went out to buy a casket. They went right down the street, Gawler's Funeral Home, walked in, they saw a huge African mahogany casket, and they said, that's the one we want. And that's the one they purchased and came back to the hospital. It would have been easy for them to take the body to Gawler's Funeral Home for embalming. The Navy refused to do the bombing. They said, it's a personal matter, it's a matter the family have to make a decision on, and we don't want to be responsible. But Miss Kennedy would not let the body leave the hospital, so the embalmers had to bring their equipment to the hospital. The embalmers did a magnificent job of restoring President Kennedy because his wound was just gaping. 4 o'clock, we left Bethesda Naval Hospital and headed to the White House in a procession. We got to the White House and we found out we're having difficulty taking this casket out. What happened was it was almost twice as heavy as the casket the president came up in from Dallas. We finally got it out, got into the White House, got it up on the catafalque, and then step back and wait for Ms. Kennedy to come down and take a final look, and she did. She cut a lock of hair from the president's head, and then the decision was made then that they would not open the casket. Not that he wasn't viewable. The embalmers, you might call them magicians, had done a great job of restoring him, but Ms. Kennedy decided she didn't want it to be viewed. She said, he looked so wax-like, you know. Well, what do you expect after what the body had gone through? So that Saturday, you watch the leaders of the world come and go in the White House, and then Sunday morning it was time to move the casket to the Capitol. As we were about to move it, there was a commotion around the television set, and we said, what is going on? It was Oswald being shot on live TV.
Here comes Oswald. He is ashen and unconscious At this time, now being moved in, he's not moving.
We glanced at the TV for a moment, but we didn't have time to watch any more of it. We had to get on over to the Capitol and get the body up the steps of the Capitol into the rotunda. The rotunda was supposed to stay open until midnight, 9 o'clock really. But people just kept coming and coming, so it stayed open all night around the clock. All the way, DC Stadium had just been built, and the line was all the way from the Capitol back to DC Stadium, 8, 9 abreast, all night long. That was the first time I got a chance to go home that weekend. I went home for about 3 hours, and on the way back on Monday morning, when we were going to be moving the casket to St. Matthew's Cathedral, it looked like the lines had not moved. People were still there. They estimated maybe 1 million people going through the rotunda that weekend. Our next move was to bring it down the steps of the rotunda and take it to St. Matthew's Cathedral for the final rites. From the White House, heads of states gathered to make the march to St. Matthew's Cathedral. All of a sudden, Miss Kennedy got out of her limousine and started walking. And all the others just jumped out of their cars and started walking behind her. There were, I guess they say it was almost 500,000 people on the street, because they were like 6 and 7 deep on the sidewalks. And that was all the way from the Capitol to St. Matthew's Cathedral and even all the way into Arlington Cemetery. The caisson arrived, we got it inside. Cardinal Cushing did the ceremony, and then we brought it outside. As we were putting it on the caisson, Little John, or John as he was called, that's when he did that historic salute, I guess, of his father's casket. And that almost took a tear from me, just to watch him do that. Don't know if he knew what was going on really, because he was only 3 years old at that point. Yeah. But that was an historic moment in my mind. Now casket's on the caisson, and we're ready to go to Arlington Cemetery, which is about 2.4 miles, I guess. And we were moving at a pretty good clip. We're marching beside the casket to the cemetery. We get to the cemetery, and the grave site is up on the hill just below the Custis Lee Mansion. Well, we're tired, so we take the casket off. Leading the procession, you have a rabbi, a priest, and a Protestant minister. And they were walking like they had no place to go, very slow, tiny steps. And with each step, that casket was getting heavier and heavier and heavier. It was almost pulling us down into the ground. So I looked at the young Marine across from me. I said, let's nudge these guys with this casket and let them know they need to step it up. So we stepped up and we nudged the last one, which was the Protestant guy, and we said, this casket's heavy, can y'all move a little faster? And then they picked up speed and we got it up to the top of the hill for the grave site.
Ready? Aim.
The guy who played taps, he played so many taps in the cemetery, never made a mistake, but that day he kind of broke up because he was broken up also.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen.
As the NCO in charge, you're responsible for what happens to the flag. You got to be sure it's folded correctly, and also to be sure there's no red showing. So I had to, it ends up in my hand. I'm the last one to do the last fold on it, so I have to check it out to be sure there's no red flowing, because that's against regulation, and then present it to the cemetery director, who then presented it to Miss Kennedy, and our job was over. You didn't have time at that moment to be sad or think of what grief or what other people were going through. Right then it was a job. Because see, behind a tree somewhere in that cemetery, there was an old sergeant with a clipboard, and he was jotting down every mistake we made, and we'd get chewed out when we got back to the barracks. You know. So that was our concern, to be sure it was flawless. Plus we knew the world was watching. So it was a job, it was the biggest job we'd ever done in the cemetery, but at the same time we knew the world was watching. So I had no emotions at that moment. Afterwards, I went home and sat down, and I think it all hit me. So for the first time, I really cried about what had happened. I had buried the President of the United States. Question that I get asked all the time by people is, how was I selected to head the casket team? Yeah. The Army operates on seniority. If it had happened 2 weeks earlier, I would have been no place in the picture. The guy who was senior to me got out, and I simply was promoted up to that slot. And that's why they canceled my leave to bring me back, because I was the senior person, senior NCO for funerals at Arlington. But that's how I end up being in that position. But if it had happened 2 weeks earlier, I would have been no place in the picture. I guess I look at it as being in the right place at the right time. There is something to that. A lot of people look for glory and look for exposure, but I never have had to do that. It found me some kind of way, and I just kind of happened to be there. It made me more conscious of history after that. It sort of grounded me, and I said from that point on, I was going to live life the fullest and don't put anything off and all of that. Didn't discourage my son from going. He went into the military, because I think the military, the other thing it did to me, it made me believe that every young man should have some military experience, whether it's just 6 months training and be ready, as the National Guard does in the Army Reserve. You can do a 6-month training and then you're ready, because it teaches you discipline, and you learn about your country, and you learn about life in the military like you can no place else. I keep saying today that we need to reinstate the draft, even if it's just for 6 months, to give the people an opportunity to get that training and experience. I like Kennedy. He was the first one to get my attention from a political standpoint. In college, in Atlanta, in 1960, when he first ran for office, we had a debate, Kennedy-Nixon. Another South Carolinian from Walterboro, Danny Mitchell, and I, we debated Kennedy's position. 2 other kids from Atlanta debated Nixon's position. We had a straw vote, and believe it or not, Nixon won the vote on an African-American campus in 1960, because Atlanta, blacks in Atlanta, were still with the Republican Party. You know. So that date and his death did much to me. I didn't realize it until later. I had watched him in 1956 when he first ran for president. Those summers I used to work in New York, and I'd work during the morning so I could be off in the evenings to watch the Democratic Convention. So Kennedy was somebody I guess I kind of identified with politically more than anybody else, and because he was making some efforts now on civil rights and so forth, it hit me hard. There was a shock there, and I just wondered what was going to happen. Were we going to slide back with some of the gains we were just beginning to make from a civil rights standpoint?
People are crying all around us. Newsmen who see death every day are crying. Congressmen, senators who love the president.
It made the world stand still. That did, November 22nd. Everything was stopped that weekend. They didn't even play NFL football that weekend. They canceled all the games. Everybody was glued to the television, those who had TVs, and you got to remember this is 1963. Color TV was just beginning to come into the picture. So people would gather at other people's homes to watch what was going, and they stayed on all night. Up to that point, television went off at 11, after the news, 11:30, 12 hours, it was over. But that weekend, or starting that day, that's why it was so significant, because first we just didn't believe it was happening, or that it had happened. And so the world stopped for a moment. It stopped for a moment, yeah.
In the days following the Kennedy funeral, Jim was granted his leave. However, his commanding officer unexpectedly died. And once again, Jim was asked to lead the funeral team. So in the span of a few days, he lost his commander-in-chief and his commanding officer. It would be more than 20 years before Jim Felder would ever go to a funeral again.